Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirard. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
So, in this episode of Disrupt Your Career, we're welcoming Valerie Sutton. Valerie is an eminent thought leader in the field of career management, having spent almost 20 years as director of the careers service at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and been for over 10 years a valuable LinkedIn Learn instructor on career management. She's also an action taker, with her role as co-founder with our friend Janine Matteau of Exponential Changemakers. So welcome, Valerie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Let's get straight in. Let's start with your career journey. You've been a stalwart force in career management, more or less right from the start of your career, holding roles at the University of Maryland, Wharton, Harvard, and more. And you're also a creator of content for online courses and the founder of a startup. So why don't you tell us how this amazing career has unfolded? Tell us about what roles design and serendipity have played, and a little bit about the high points and the moments of challenge.
Yes, I've spent the majority of my career in the career development field. But prior to that, actually, I made a poor career choice. And so directly out of undergraduate, I thought I was really interested in fashion. I loved fashion. And so
been there.
Yeah, I joined a leadership development team and I wanted to be a buyer. And one of the rotations was actually being an assistant buyer for the department store. And I realized that I absolutely hated it. It was working on Excel spreadsheets, not my strength. I can do it, but don't love it. So the rotation, I ended up doing more of the human resources and the management piece of things. So hiring, firing, really understanding how to motivate employees. I ended up getting known for being able to go in and clean house and fire people, which is, you can be good at something. That doesn't mean you want to do it, right? And so I examined myself, and I actually, at the time, I didn't know it was this, but a gap analysis of what are some career options, exploration, and then what am I missing to get to this point? So from a serendipity standpoint, I actually talked to my father, who is a big influence in my life. And he was like, the thing that I said was, I want to help people with their careers, because why are people ending up where they're ending up? And he's like, you can be a coach at a university and help people do this, which required my master's degree. And so that's where I went back for my master's and landed in career services. Now, from a planning and serendipity standpoint, I would say it's both, because I did do a lot of planning. I'm a big fan of the gap analysis of understanding where you want to be. And I wanted to be that director of career services. So in my early career, I was taking on a lot of stretch assignments around management, around how to get funding, different sort of things that would help me to get to that point. But also serendipity played a part in, when I applied to Wharton, where it was really good economy. And so my experience was at University of Maryland. I had a business background as far as retail, but not investment banking and consulting. A year later, after I got hired at Wharton, the economy tanked. And so I would have never gotten hired at that point, because there were so many people coming from investment banking and consulting and saying, I want to be a career coach, right? And hire me at career services, because I've been through this. And so a lot of the business schools at that time were hiring people from industry, because they could talk to what it was like being in the industry. Not necessarily that they were great coaches or that, but there was some credibility there in the MBA world. So that's where serendipity really came in. Another thing, and I don't know if this is serendipity, but it is definitely some implicit bias. 3 times in my life, I have been told that I got the job after getting it. I always ask, why did I get the job?
It's such a great question.
And 3 times I've been told, well, you looked the part. And so when you examine that, you're like, oh, like a lot of people will think that's complimentary, but all that means to me is that I'm white, I'm cisgender, I was of childbearing age, I could dress like a business person, right? But it wasn't about my expertise. And so it made me work harder. And so I wanted to be that expert. I wanted to be that person that, like, you wouldn't question the fact that I got it because I'm the acceptable diversity candidate, right? So I think that that's partly bias, but it's that serendipity thing of where sometimes you just don't have control over those things. And sometimes you do, like I did dress the part, I was in my navy blue suit at business school and made sure that I looked, could present myself well.
Beautiful. I love that question of timing and how that is sometimes something you can control, and sometimes it really is purely serendipitous, felicitous, call it what you want, but it is often everything. And that sort of flipping of looking the part and using that as a reason to get better. So you stopped getting it because you were blonde, pretty, middle class and could dress properly. It's a very strange world that we live in, but we need to learn to play it so that the greater good becomes even greater, right? And that you clearly recognize that.
Well, and that's why I have such a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because a lot of times, they probably thought that this was a very complimentary statement and weren't trying to be harmful in it. But it's also recognizing that, folks have challenges and how to overcome those challenges. And one of the reasons I got involved with the Harvard Scholars at Risk was really understanding that they're coming into a whole new culture. So they're not necessarily fitting in on multiple levels. If you use like Hofstede's theory, right? And so there's high context and low context. And if you're in an interview and you're high context and you're interviewing in the US, where most people are low context, you're going to have a challenge. And so this is why I do what I do.
Fantastic. You've worked in some incredible places. What lessons did you learn working in all those different august institutions? And how have these lessons proven their worth in the world of startups and content creation as well?
I have loved my experience at universities, and for the longest time, it fit my working identity. So I always say the difference between working in business schools versus the ed school is that when you're in a business school, you're working with students that want to run the world. And when you're at the ed school, you're working with students that want to save the world, right? And so I've learned first and foremost so much from my students, because there are different ways of approaching careers. There's that very structured, strategic way, and then there's the more creative and, flow to careers that people approach from that perspective. So I think one of the things that was most enhanced through both experiences was really coaching techniques and knowing when to bring in different types of coaching techniques depending on the client. So you're not just going to approach everybody in that same way. The difference between the ed school and the business school, though, is when you're working at a university, you're always educating yourself. Like, there's never a time that you are not learning. And so when I was in the MBA world, I feel like I have a virtual MBA, even though I don't, because I worked in it for so long. And every learning opportunity we had was really around building strategies. It was really around, how do you innovate? How do you bring technology into what you're doing? The gap analysis tool that I frequently use with clients actually came from my experience working at business schools. When I did it for myself, I didn't know it was a gap analysis, but then I was like, oh, this makes sense to use in career coaching. Now, on the ed school side, I learned about adult development and learning theories. And so it was really taking, when you think about online education, how do you impact learners and how are they learning, right? So there's two things. So first, I use Bloom's taxonomy a lot, and that came from my experience working at the ed school. And then the second thing is really adult development theory and understanding the stages of career from that perspective. And so I think there's a lot of advantages in working in universities just for your ability to learn and to take the theories from the faculty research and then apply it to practice. And that's really where my expertise lies. It's really taking that theory and then applying it to practice. And so some of the things that I'm interested in right now is really around gender bias with exponential change makers. And so I'm really looking at the research behind that and then saying, how do you apply this not only to the individual that's moving through their career, but also to policies within organizations that may affect. And so something I'm looking at right now is generative AI and how bias is actually within generative AI. And so as women are preparing for their careers, and if they're using AI, which most folks will be using, how do you spot that? How do you look for when something is gender biased that's coming out from a generative AI language model or any other type of AI, whether it's visual or auditory, those types of things?
Fantastic. I guess what you're referring to in very brief layman's terms is the fact that the generative AI has been built by white male engineers, and therefore, however hard they've tried to be open in what they've created, they've built in biases that come from their backgrounds, their assumptions, and their clients and ecosystems assumptions about what different successes look like in different careers.
Yeah, and I don't want to say it's necessarily white male, because you look at the background of what's written and what's on the web, and this is all taking from what's existing out there, right? And then the second thing is, we all hold biases, whether we're men or women or, a person of color or not, and there's the intersection of identities. And so a lot of times it's systemic and we don't know that it's happening. It's very implicit.
Absolutely.
But there is gender bias in the system and it's systemic. It's not something that's one person is doing.
So let's not go too far down that rabbit hole. But I guess what we're saying is whatever has been deemed successful in the past, it's important not to characterize that as necessarily being the key to success in the future.
Absolutely.
Good. Let's move on. Let's talk about this big transition. You spent decades as head of careers in incredibly important and preeminent institutions, and now you're a co-founder. That's a really enormous disruptive change, which is what we love most, but it's a challenge. Talk us through that.
First of all, the decision to make the change is that it's really great to have a framework to make changes from. And I work off of a working identity framework that I developed while I was at Harvard. And there are 4 quadrants within a career, not just a job, but thinking about your career. And so there's your mission alignment. What are you passionate about? Like I said, fashion earlier, understanding careers. I also love fitness. So those are the things that really get me going. The second thing is using the skills you love to use. So I mentioned that I hated working with Excel spreadsheets. I can do it. I just don't love sitting all day with an Excel spreadsheet.
I identify.
Yeah. And so those are the skills that you love to use. Then there's your work culture, the culture that best supports you. And for a long time, universities supported my work culture. And then there are your life needs. So that's your financial needs, your geographic needs, family needs, identity needs that you need to come from the work environment. The 2 things that were no longer matching up for me when I made the decision, because I've always done side gigs and more, right? There's never a time that I haven't done something beyond just my job. And the work culture was no longer matching up. It was no longer supportive of what my needs are for in the working environment. And then my life needs also changed. So I was helping with elderly parents in a different state. I needed more flexibility. And so those 2 things changed for me. And that's when I made the decision to change. And the reason I could do that is that I had the financial stability to be able to make the leap, which is really important in that life needs stage. Because when you think about doing a startup, you're not necessarily making the salary that you made before. And so you're like, okay, I'm doing the startup and I need to have income coming in. So having that financial stability really made a difference to be able to make the leap. And there's things that I miss. So I actually really miss working with some of the faculty that are at HGSC. They were just like Monica Higgins, and she did the developmental network framework. I worked with Fernando Reimers, and we were working on competency-based programming for the international education students. And so really looking at international development. So I had so many interesting projects with faculty, really based on research. And I don't have that collaboration any longer. I could probably eventually build it in, but it's not structured into my job anymore. That's something that I miss. I also miss the sort of ebb and flow. Like I knew what was happening yearly. Like even though we would do different strategies and students might come in with different interest and adapt, you have career decision making when you come in, you have professional networking second, then we start thinking about the application process. Then we go into the interviewing process, and then we go into salary negotiations. And we had a year program. So it was very structured. I knew the timing for the majority of folks' searches based on the industry, all of this, we were able to segment it. So I missed that sort of ebb and flow. But on the other hand, it's super exciting to be in a startup and to be just riffing off each other. So Janine and I are oftentimes we're in a meeting and we're like, what about this? Oh, wow, that's a great idea. Let's go here. And so it's new, it's exciting. It's still at my core of really helping people navigate their careers, but it's specifically aligned with my passion around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and specifically gender, and helping women advance in their careers. So there is that excitement and that love for what I do. It's just a different ebb and flow at this point.
Absolutely. The common thread is very clear. What advice would you give early career professionals as they're starting to think about what are they going to do? You know, they've gone to school, they haven't gone to school, whatever they're doing, but they're making their choices. It's a complex world in 2023 and beyond. What would you be suggesting that these young people think about?
Well, the first thing is understanding your values, because there is the continuum in early career from those folks that aren't going on for higher education and maybe entering a trade or some other form of a job, right? Versus the person that will go on, like my niece is going for her PhD right now, right? And so there's this big trajectory for her. So the first thing that I would start with is really understanding what your values are, because some people just want a job. They don't want a career. And a career is really that there's some type of theme behind your career and you're navigating in different spaces. And there are many jobs within a career versus just a job that is providing you with your life needs. And then you have other things. So I look at the young person that wants adventure and is like just funding their adventure through their work, right? And that is fine. So start with your values. The second thing is look at a working identity. Like I said, that's what are your passions? What are the skills you love to use? What's the work culture and your life needs? If you solidly have that framework, and you can weight it at different times, like, work culture was very important to me when I made this change and getting into environments that I felt valued. And so I weighted that more heavily when I made the choice. So this allows you to make effective decisions in your career and also leads you to getting exposed to careers that match your identity versus going to your folks and saying, hey, what should I do? And they're like, well, accounting's a safe job and you can get a pension, right? Mm-hmm. So you can explain to them, that's not a skill that I love and I want to work off my strengths and here are my passions. And then you can get better direction and exposure to different careers. And exposure is the number one reason people choose a career, is because they've seen it. The second thing I would do, or I guess this would be the third, is to actually do a gap analysis, like I said, and say, based on getting exposure and career decision, this is what I want to do. What is it I need to do to get there so that it's less serendipity and more of the planning piece of things? And so that gap analysis should probably be done on a yearly basis so that you can be asking for the stretch projects, that you can be doing volunteer work that allows you to build skills in a particular area, and then you're going to be more successful ultimately.
Wonderful. So let's talk about one of your side gigs, which doesn't sound as sidey as it might. You've got roles as chair of Massachusetts Workforce Association, the Metro North Regional Employment Board, and Harvard Scholars at Risk. I mean, all of those sound pretty fancy, pretty important, possibly rather time-consuming. What was your motivation to get so involved, and how do you juggle your time in order to do justice to all of those roles and your day job? And of course, your day job has shifted over time from those institutions to your status as a founder. And how do you, in all of that, stay healthy and happy? And further, what skills and learning do you take across from your volunteering that produces valuable experience in your day jobs?
If you look at my volunteering, it all aligns with my passion of really understanding careers and really how people navigate through their careers. So none of my volunteer work is like a totally separate passion, which helps the balance because I'm not trying to relearn something or learn something new. It's like I'm bringing some expertise and value to the organization because of my knowledge, right? And so each of these are about that. The reason I chose each of them is twofold. First, it aligns with that commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because when you're working for workforce development, the Harvard Scholars at Risk, these are folks that are not coming from a point of privilege. And so they have a lot of barriers to moving up. And one of my biggest is really helping folks from a low socioeconomic class move up into a higher socioeconomic class. And then how do you navigate that? So that's a lot of the workforce development piece of things. And then the Harvard Scholars at Risk is really about the challenge of somebody that had horrible circumstances in their home country and were under threat of potential death or imprisonment. And so they're coming over here in a fellowship mode, and oftentimes they may be seeking asylum. And so they have so many challenges to overcome just from a cultural context, along with a visa context, right? And so that's one of the reasons that I got involved, is it just gives me a more expansive way to have the impact I would like to have in the world. The second thing is it allows me to fill gaps in my experience. So actually use it in my day job. So when I think about the experiences that I've had, like I have done a C-level search for nonprofits and I've led it and I understand the process. I understand how to work with the executive search firms. And so I can bring that into my daily practice because I have been there. I have set up compensation systems and understand like how do you retain employees through the compensation and benefits that you're offering in an organization. And so each time that I volunteer for something, I'm always looking for something that I want to strengthen too. So when I'm in the organization, I give a lot of my knowledge, but I'm also volunteering for the things that are stretch assignments for me. So, thinking about strategy, putting your hand up for a leadership position. So I was like, hey, I want to be vice chair and I want to look at a strategic from a region and not just from a school. When I look at compensation, it's not from a small staff budget, but it's looking at external equity, internal equity, and then individual. And then how do you build that plan around it so that folks feel valued? So those are a couple of the things that I've gotten to do that have filled gaps in my experience. I'm the current treasurer because I wanted to work with a larger budget at the Mass Metro, because universities typically have really tiny budgets for career services offices. And this allowed me to work with a budget that was much, much higher than the current budget that I had.
That's really impressive use of that whole experimentation part of one's career. Very nice. In a recent article you published, you talk about the performance of mutuality in networking. Now, we probably both know how much many people in the audience will cringe at the absolute mention of the N word.
Yeah.
But you set out some wonderful strategies for developing professional relationships in which you make a very clear distinction between cultivating and leveraging relationships. Can you share with us the thinking in that article, as well as the strategies that you recommend for using this mutuality to work and network smarter, especially in the exploration phase of careers?
Yeah, and I think the reason that network has such a bad name is because the automatic assumption is that somebody is going to be asking you for something right away, or I'm going to be. So people network when they need it. And so you haven't developed a relationship to be able to leverage that network. And so you're walking into a situation where you're trying to leverage something where you have no relationship with anybody. And so networking should be just a regular process. And think about the purposes of networking, which makes it easier. So when you think about the purpose of networking, a lot of people are just like, oh, it's to find a job. And it's not just to find a job. So the first thing I think of is career exploration. Like, I just want to learn about a career. I'm thinking about pivoting. Does it align with my working identity? People love to talk about themselves and they love to talk about their careers. And so just knowing that they love this and they want to share, that's part of mutuality as well. But then there's also working smarter. And so in working smarter, it's about understanding your current job and what are new trends, what's happening. Like, I just was having a conversation with the chancellor at Penn State, and we were talking about AI, and he's doing a lot around sort of academic integrity around AI and that sort of thing. And I've been doing research on the platforms that are using AI. And so I was able to say, oh, these are 2 new platforms. You should be able to check them out. So it's about giving, and that working smarter is the perfect place to be giving to each other, right? So I was learning about academic integrity. He was learning about some of these new sites. It worked out perfectly. And it was just a random conversation. We both found out that we were LinkedIn learning authors. And I was like, oh, we should talk. We're, in the same town, and let's, have a conversation. And so it ended up being a beautiful conversation. And you never know what's going to happen in the future, but hopefully there will be some type of collaboration or something. I don't know, but it was just about working smarter. And then there's the advancement. So that's, other than job search, the 4th reason is you're trying to advance in your career. And that's where you're trying to get sponsors. But if you use the strategies beforehand, you're going to have a much easier time when it comes to advancement and job search, because those are the 2 areas where it's more about leveraging relationships. Working smarter and career discovery is more about the mutuality and being able to give back. But if you're in a situation where you have to leverage a relationship before you've cultivated it, this is where you want to show your appreciation and to make sure that you're available for them in the future. Because again, it is that mutuality. So even though you have to try and leverage it, there are ways that you can give back that seem genuine and that create a relationship versus just using somebody one time to be like, can I get an employee referral to this job? So I hope that helps.
It really does. And one thing that strikes me again and again, and I think you've highlighted it really well, is that there's another dimension, which is that of just having fun. That conversation that you described with the Chancellor of Wharton, that sounded like fun. In the end, you can almost say, who the hell cares whether it led to more knowledge or another connection that might get you another job or role in the future. It sounds as though it was just awfully interesting and amusing. And therefore,
Yeah.
I think that's a part that people so often forget. They get focused on, it's a task, I must do it. And, I must go to the gym and lift weights or whatever. I must do networking because I've been told and I get intellectually that it's a good idea to do it preventively as well as in a first aid situation. But beyond that, however introverted anybody might be, it can also just be quite simply fun and valuable and insightful to have conversations with other people who aren't
intellectually challenging, right?
Yes.
You meet somebody and you're aligned with them in so many different ways, and you're like, you jump from one thing to another, and you're like, and that was that conversation that I had. So it's building some time into your schedule for it, because if you aren't that person that is like naturally reaches out to folks, think about your purpose and then say, I'm going to do this once a week, and it's about working smarter. I want to learn about a new technology. I want to learn how somebody progressed through their career from an advancement standpoint, so that I might look at my gap analysis and say, what are the stretch projects that I want to do so that it prepares me for my next role?
Wonderful. So if you could change one thing about the world of work, all those employers that you've dealt with as a career service head, as you look at the different organizations with whom you're interacting as a founder, if you could just change one thing about the world of work, what would it be?
Transparency. It would probably eliminate my job.
I'm laughing much too heartily here, but please carry on.
Yeah. So there's just no transparency in the process. And so it leaves people wondering, right? And so there's not enough communication from the employer side. And so folks feel ghosted and they feel, but I understand it, but there's automation, there's technology that can now take care of that. There's, when you think about bias in the world, pay equity and transparency in that solves a lot when you're transparent and you give a small range, not that large range, because they're never giving you the top of that range, right? So I'm like, oh yeah, they're sharing a range, but it's $100,000 range. This is not helpful, right? So being more transparent of this is literally the range, like the small range we offer between this and this. So pay transparency. I think transparency in what they really need for a position, because I find a lot of people are applying for jobs that they're either underqualified for or so overqualified for. And if you're clear about those expectations of what is needed for the position, then employers won't have the problem of these people applying for positions that they are clearly not qualified for. And so I think transparency is the biggest thing that I could say for employers to use is what do they actually need and what are they actually paying for what they need?
Indeed. So important, so crucial, and so rare. Let's go back to 18-year-old Valerie. If you could go back to her now and hold her hand gently and kindly and tell her things that you didn't know then or that she didn't know then, what would you be telling her?
I've been so fortunate in life. Even the bad things, I wouldn't necessarily change because it ultimately led to a good thing. So if I were to say something to my 18-year-old self is to say, you know what, there's going to be really crappy things that are going to happen. The economy is going to drop, whatever is going to change. As long as you have the critical thinking skills, you're going to be able to get through any of those challenges because you don't know. Like, I really loved your question around serendipity, right? Because there are these things in your life that you just don't have control with, and you need to have the faith that I've got this. And surround yourself with people that are supportive of you. And that's where I've been incredibly fortunate, where if I took on, I had a phenomenal mother, and if I took on a challenge, I knew she had my back. Like if I failed, I knew somebody had my back. And so I think surrounding yourself with people, and if you don't have that family like I had, surrounding yourself with friends that do have that sort of philosophy. So that's what I would tell my 18-year-old self.
I think that's fantastic. It makes so much sense. And I love the fact that you allude to the fact that you don't have to have perfect parents in order to create that support and nurturing system. You do have to be clear, perhaps, and form an image of what you want and need so that if you need to go and look for them elsewhere, you know what you're looking for.
Mentorship, right?
Exactly.
And knowing the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. And this is where I do definitely recommend Monica Higgins' Developmental Network. She has a really great way of framing what these folks might look like in your career specifically.
Perhaps we should get her on the podcast.
Yeah.
She's inspired you. There's no doubt she could inspire us and the rest of our audience. Finally, Valerie, obviously you're in this beautiful beginning, not quite beginning, but important starting up phase of exponential change makers. What are the most exciting projects that are on your plate for the next 6 months or year?
Yeah, so I was talking earlier about riffing with Janine on ideas and projects and that sort of thing. And so one of the ones that I'm really excited about is that we're launching special interest cohorts. So as part of the membership plan for early career women, we have all of the online content and course curriculum of where you're going to find gender bias and then how you can overcome it or how you can rethink it. But what we're adding to this is a cohort experience. And so the first one that I'm launching is around artificial intelligence and thinking about, first and foremost, where there is bias and why it's essential for women to be in the generative AI world so that we can be picking up on the things that are happening within generative AI. And then it's what does the landscape look like in generative AI? And then how do you align your skills with what is needed in this emerging field. And so that will be launching in October. So if anybody is interested in that, you'll find more information on exponentialchangemakers.com. And then we'll be doing some subsequent ones after the AI. So on safety science, on education technology, and international development.
Wonderful. Valerie, we've covered so much. I know we could carry on for a long time, but you know what the sort of tolerance for podcast listeners is. So let's call it a day here. And I want to thank you for coming along with such varied content, different perspectives, extraordinary experience, and sharing all of that with our listeners. I know they're going to love it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And I feel like we could talk for hours. And so I would love to stay in touch because this has just really been a fascinating conversation.
We're just getting going, that's for sure.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.